We've been working for over 29 years to restore the Cheat River. I'm going to go over what that's really looked like throughout our history. So a little context about the Cheat River watershed. Like I mentioned, we're in it right here today. A lot of the kind of iconic places in West Virginia are within the Cheat River watershed, including Blackwater Falls, a lot of the Monongahela National Forest, so about a third of our watershed also shares ownership underneath the Monongahela National Forest. Areas like Shavers Fork, if you're familiar with the Jenkinsburg Bridge or High Bridge area, kind of outside of Morgantown, those areas all are part of our watershed. It's a fairly large watershed. We're about 1,400 square miles, so pretty large for the state of West Virginia. You'll see that black star there, that's actually our headquarters in Kingwood. So we're in the lower part of the watershed. The Cheat and its tributaries end up flowing north, merging in Parsons, and then eventually making their way to what's called Cheat Lake, which is a reservoir, before going into the Monongahela River outside or near the border of West Virginia and Pennsylvania. So Friends of the Cheat, we are a nonprofit watershed group. Like I said, based in Kingwood. Right now we are a staff of 6. We're about to add our 7th employee, which we're very excited about. She starts November 1st. And really our roots are in water quality improvements, namely acid mine drainage treatment. So you'll see that photograph at the top right there. That is one of our treatment sites called Blood Lagoon. I'm sure you can guess why it's called that. So what you're seeing there is really high levels of iron. And this is related to abandoned mine lands throughout Preston County. The photograph on the bottom is essentially what we do at these treatment sites. So we end up taking that water emanating from an abandoned mine land site, and we end up creating a treatment system to pass that water through. And the goal of that is the water that comes in is usually extremely acidic, and I'll go into that a little bit later. It has really high metal concentrations that are toxic to aquatic life. And we pass it through a series of different treatment components so that by the time that water exits our system, it is pH circumneutral, so a healthy pH range, and we ultimately look for a goal of 80% reduction of our metal loads. And in an ideal scenario, we would have non-detect metal concentrations coming out of our system, what we call our system out. So that photograph on the bottom right, that is a site where we are meeting those water quality goals. pH is usually around 7 to 7.5, and our metals are pretty consistently non-detect and have been consistently meeting water quality standards for iron and aluminum. I had to include a picture of Cheat Fest, because as many people know about the Cheat River Festival, not everyone associates it with our organization. So I want to lay claim to that and make sure it's known that that is our one of our largest, actually our largest annual fundraiser. So those that attend Cheat Fest, that is a huge driver of our organization and our ability to do this work. Very important to us, and it's our way to connect with our local river community. And really, I'll go into a little bit about why our organization was formed to begin with. So we were formed in 1994 as a response to really egregious water quality problems in the Cheat River watershed. And essentially, the community around the Cheat River, and this included not only folks recreating, so boaters, but also folks local to that community, were really tired of seeing the condition of the Cheat in the state that it was in. So the photographs here show essentially the catalyst for our organization. This is the Muddy Creek blowout on the left. So you can see that's the Cheat River. We're flowing, let's see if I can do the laser pointer. We're flowing this direction. So upstream, downstream, this is Muddy Creek. So upstream of here, there was a mine site where there were, and I'll get into the specifics about pre and post law mining, but essentially there was an active mine that had some pretty nasty water that they pumped into an abandoned mine next door, so to speak. Well, eventually that pressure built up enough that it released and blew out of the hillside and spilled all of this toxic metal-laden water into the cheat. And this is really what caused the community to respond and form Friends of the Cheat, and basically, determined that they had had enough of this type of egregious water quality degradation in the watershed. Unfortunately, the cheat had actually been pretty degraded prior to that as well. So even before the Muddy Creek blowouts, the cheat main stem throughout the Cheat Canyon was, typically below 5 in pH. Very few aquatic organisms were living there. Mostly very pollution-tolerant species were living in this part of the cheat at this time. And so the photograph on the right is a photograph of the Cheat Canyon around this time. The photograph on the left was 1994. To my knowledge, the photograph on the right was 1988, so even before the blowout, and that was from Ben Faulkner. So, like I mentioned, the status of the cheat even before this event was pretty impaired. So this is one of my favorite quotes that captures, what happened to the cheat at the turn of the century. I won't read it for you, I'll let you read it. But essentially, even parts of the cheat that we at Friends of the Cheat maybe had thought were our high quality sections, the section that is now beloved as the water trail from Parsons through to Rollsburg, was really heavily impacted, not only from acid mine drainage that came in from the Black Fork and from the Blackwater River, but untreated sewage, tanneries, mills, all that extractive industry that took place, as well as the big cut of the landscape level removal of our forests, kind of created this deadly cocktail that caused issues for aquatic organisms throughout really the turn of the 1900s. And so by the 1990s, we had lost all 8 species of our freshwater mussels in the Cheat River. We also lost a lot of our pollution-sensitive species, so walleye, while they are considered a sport fish, they're also very sensitive to acidity, as are smallmouth bass. So we lost walleye completely from the Cheat River system. And at this time, the pH at Cheat Lake was typically less than 5. And like I mentioned, dominated by really pollution or intolerant species in the lake. And by 1995, we were named one of America's most endangered rivers because of this effect. And just remember, Cheat Lake is at the terminus of our river, so all of those impacts were collecting and settling essentially in that reservoir. The photograph on the bottom is a picture of a fish kill that took place in the 30s, and you can see, for those of you who are fish nerds like me, there are walleye in this assortment of fish that were killed in the Cheat. And this record here on the right, if I go back one more, there we go. The record here on the right, this is a record of the pollution in the Cheat River in 1929. So you can see, I blew up those points there. We've got Rollsburg and Albright had a pH of 4.2. So for those of you, I'm sure most of you are familiar with the pH scale, but just in case, pH should range somewhere between 6.5, 7.5. pH 4.2, there's not really many fish species, if any, that can tolerate that low of a pH. So to go into more of the history of the mining in our watershed, I pulled up this map of the Preston County abandoned mineland sites. It's quite extensive, really, the amount of mining that took place in this watershed. And that does include pre and post law. So the photograph, or the map on the right, is only showing what we would consider pre-law mining activities. There's also post-law mining activities. So when I say that, what I'm referring to is the Surface Mining Control Reclamation Act of 1977. So essentially before then, there wasn't really any legal mechanism to hold coal companies accountable for the pollution that they created. So that's why they're called abandoned mine lands, right? They took the coal, they left. there was no legal obligation for them to remediate those sites or clean up the water quality impairments that were caused from those sites. After the passing of SMCRA in 1977, that gave a legal mechanism to hold coal companies somewhat accountable for the degradation that occurred from the mining. And that's what we would consider, some of those sites now in Preston County we would call a bond forfeiture site. It's a site where they collected, they finished their mining operations, they put up money to say, you know, this is the money that would be used to clean up or restore the site afterward. And then essentially when they seize that, that money goes to the state to reclaim those sites. I could spend all day talking about how that's not enough money to actually pay for this reclamation work, because acid mine drainage operates on a geologic timescale, not on a human timescale. The sites that we look to restore will continue to perpetuate this acidic material for hundreds of years, most likely, if not even further, as far as I understand. So that's a little bit about pre- and post-law mining, and then within that, there's also the priorities of the Office of Surface Mining, so who oversees essentially abandoned mine lands work. So those priorities for sites are broken up into P1, P2, and P3 priorities. Unfortunately for water quality work, we're a P3 priority, so we're the last on the totem pole. The first two priorities are more related to health and human safety, making sure someone doesn't fall into an open mine portal, making sure that there's not going to be a major landslide. And as those things are extremely important as well, P3s are often overlooked because the money that's available is first sorted to those P1 and P2 priorities. So acid mine drainage, what is it? How is it formed? So really, acid mine drainage is a chemical reaction between water and the geology containing sulfur-bearing materials. The area that the cheat falls in, both in Preston and Tucker County, have really what we call pyrite-rich material in these adjacent to and in these coal seams. So pyrite's also known as fool's gold. Unfortunately, in this situation, it's not something you want to see. And when you expose that to air and water, it creates sulfuric acid, and you also have metals associated with that, typically iron and aluminum. And both of those are also toxic to aquatic life. So that's really, a brief summary of what that looks like. And what's important to mention is the mining itself doesn't cause acid mine. I mean, it does cause acid mine drainage, but it's not the coal that creates it. It's the pyritic material associated with that coal seam. And I say that because any earth-moving activity could also generate this type of acidic material. It's really the action of exposing that pyritic material to air and water. So it doesn't have to be a mining activity. There's other earth-moving activities that can cause this release of acidic material. So this is a photograph of the Cheat River in 2019. So this is metal precipitation in action. We have Lick Run here. You can see how small this tributary is. This is our largest contributor to acid in the Cheat River watershed. So what you're seeing here is a picture of the Cheat in extreme low flow during the summertime, and all of that acidic material and the metals that are essentially what we would consider dissolved. So the water that's coming out here, if you were to pick it up in a cup, is actually crystal clear because all those metals are still suspended in solution. They're dissolved in the water. When it mixes with the Cheat, which is upstream of here around 7.5, we're getting that fluctuation in pH, where now the pH has moved up enough that our iron's falling out, which is what you're seeing in red. And then even further, once we move up into about 5.5, our aluminum is starting to fall out. So I call this the rainbow sherbet effect that's happening here on the Cheat. And essentially, I would assume during this time, this is creating a chemical barrier where fish and other organisms are likely not moving through this part of the cheat because it's the toxicity of the metals and the pH would likely be enough that they wouldn't prefer to move through this section of the cheat at this time. There are unfortunate consequences to increasing the metal loadings in the cheat, so that includes respiratory and reproduction effects to fish. And also, when those metals fall out of solution, they also coat the bottom of the stream and can also armor the bottom of the stream. So it's not uncommon for some of these streams in Preston County that are orange from all this acid mine drainage. You go to try to move a rock, and it's armored in place. So you have to really pull to try to get that rock out of place. And that really has consequences for any sort of aquatic organism that would use those interstitial spaces for habitat. So going into water quality standards, the things that we look at our mine land sites, most specifically are pH, but then we also look at aluminum and iron. So typically we're looking at dissolved aluminum and total iron. So total iron is when the iron falls out of that solution. It's no longer suspended. And I want to make sure to point out we have warm water fisheries standards, and then we have trout standards. Trout standards are much more stringent than our warm water fisheries standards. And you can see how low this number is for dissolved aluminum and for iron. So treating acid mine drainage is an uphill battle. It's a daunting battle. These are the 344 identified seeps within the Cheat River watershed. We can assume that there are many more that are not identified. So it can be really challenging to decide which one to tackle, how to tackle these problems, how to make an effective strategy for treating this pollution source. And you can see where you have those clusters of red dots, you also have red streams. So our red streams are streams that are impaired, classified as impaired by the state of West Virginia. Another complication is ownership. So after the mining companies mine these lands that are now considered abandoned mine lands, those lands were sold to private landowners. So these seeps exist on private lands, which requires a lot of coordination and effort and relationship building to treat these sources. So how do we even begin to think about this? So the old way, when we first got started, was what we consider a shotgun approach. So we were just gung-ho to work with anyone that had acid mine drainage on their property and wanted to see it treated. So much of our early days consisted around developing those sites. However, because there wasn't kind of a larger planning initiative, we weren't seeing large improvements to water quality outside of just what we consider our system out. So stream-wise, we weren't seeing great improvements to our water quality standards because all of our sites were kind of peppered throughout the landscape instead of focused and centralized in certain areas. So now what we do is we first do what we call a watershed-based plan. So we spend about 3 or 4 years extensively studying one watershed, identifying all the sources, quantifying all the sources by collecting multiple samples and taking our in-stream samples to understand which sites are having the most impact on our stream system. And right now we have 3 plans that have been completed. We have one for Muddy Creek, one for Big Sandy Creek, one for the North Fork of Greens Run. We have 2 that are in planning stage as we speak, so that's Roaring Creek and the Shavers Fork watershed. So what does that actually entail? Like I mentioned, when I say we're going out taking samples, we're taking both field measurements and lab measurements. So we're taking a lot of what we consider a grab sample and looking at those total and dissolved metals when we're out on a site. We're also looking at flow so we can quantify loadings of these pollutant sources. And when able, we are also looking at our benthic macroinvertebrate populations and our fish populations, if we're lucky enough to have them in certain stream systems. And the big component of moving this on to the next phase is that landowner and outreach development. It is the most critical part of what we do because these sites exist on private lands, is building those relationships with folks and really working across the aisle to see these projects move forward. Preston County is a pretty conservative county, and the areas that we work in are very rural. And really these folks are doing this because they care about water quality. And that can be actually pretty uplifting to meet in the middle on something, because these landowners do not receive any money for these projects. They don't receive any tax incentive for these projects. They really have to want to do them because they care about the quality of water that goes into the creek. And these sites can be anywhere from 1 acre to 3 acres. So imagine someone comes up to you that you don't know, or maybe you know very little, and says, can I build something that's going to take up 3 acres of your land, and I'm not going to pay you for it, and you're not going to get a tax break for it. So they do provide quite a bit and are huge and instrumental in making sure that these projects move forward. How we actually build these in terms of our funding mechanisms consists of funding from the EPA, their 319 or non-point source pollution program. That funding gets funneled through the state, which then we apply for through different grant opportunities. And then we match those funds with funds from the Office of Surface Mining, Reclamation and Enforcement under the Department of Interior. And this is really only possible through that SMACRA legislature, which has to be reauthorized every so often. And we were lucky enough that it was reauthorized recently, but that was something we were very concerned about. If it wasn't going to be reauthorized, we wouldn't have that matching fund to implement these types of projects. So once we have our funding in hand, we have our landowner on board, we've studied the site, we understand the importance of that site to reducing loads in our stream system. We then procure an engineer who will then design the site. We don't have design experience in-house. We work with qualified firms to design something based on the water chemistry data that we collect. One thing that we always have to think about is passive versus active treatment. So the level of impairment will dictate whether or not you can manage a passive treatment site in a location versus an active treatment site. Passive, really to summarize that, it would be a system that is typically no power or low power or solar power. It doesn't have any sort of mechanisms in place to continue to have it work continuously. Really the big difference is these larger sites that consist of like a limestone leach bed, settling pond, wetland complex that would be considered passive. An active treatment site is when you see a limestone doser next to the creek, or the large treatment scale facilities such as the one on Maddy Creek or the one that's being proposed on the North Fork of Blackwater. They're more industrial in scale, the active treatment sites. So for a small organization like Friends of the Cheat, we aren't really equipped to handle an active treatment site. So we typically work on sites that can be done through passive treatment. Another thing we think about is how long these sites will be in implementation for. Like I said, acid mine drainage operates on a geologic time scale, not a human time scale. So these sites have a lifespan on them. We like to maximize that as long as we can. Typically, it's around 15 to 25 years before it needs to be improved. We need to replenish the limestone, we need to stir the limestone, we need to dredge the ponds. So this isn't one and done restoration, this is a commitment into perpetuity. And I think that's important to note because it just isn't something that we ever will be able to walk away from in my lifetime and the next generation's lifetime. There are a lot of permits associated with this work that we do. We do have to work with, the one that we always will end up receiving is the NPDES permit. So we do have to make sure that we're not actually causing harm in the process of implementing these sites by releasing sediment. We also work with SHPO and Endangered Species Act consultation because we do have that federal nexus with federal funds. At times, there are other permits that are necessary, including an Army Corps engineering permit, as well as stream activity permit, depending on the site. We try as much as possible to not have to work in what would be considered a stream, but at times we do based on our site constraints. And I will note that these streams that we do work in, and I'll show a photograph of this shortly, are heavily degraded, and a lot of them are actually conveyances created by the mining companies to essentially berm and get that pollution off the site as quickly as possible. So these are not pristine streams that we're typically working in. So here's one of our sites that was completed in 2020. The photograph on the right is our before, the left is after. This was the largest acidic source to Beaver Creek in Preston County. Beaver Creek is a trout stream. So this was in our sites for almost 20 years, and that's where that landowner component is so important. The first landowner that we approached was not interested in this because of the footprint. Since then, that landowner sold that property to a new landowner who was interested in working with us. So we were able to implement this project. Typically, it takes about 3 months from start of construction to completion. And what you're seeing is essentially, this is that mine conveyance channel that I was talking about. Army Corps would consider this a stream. pH here was really low, typically around 3, and we obviously had a lot of metals that we were concerned about, particularly iron at this site. So what we are looking at here, this is where the source used to emanate from, this road cut. We have a collection basin. It feeds through a limestone leach bed, so essentially the water fills to a certain elevation. It triggers a flush in what we call our siphon vault. So this is completely power-free. It's all gravity-fed, which is really helpful for us because nothing goes down, so to speak, in terms of issues with electricity. Once it triggers a flush, it goes to the settling pond. This is where we collect all those metals that would normally be going into the creek. So instead, they stay on site. And because this photograph was taken just a week before we signed our substantial completion of construction, it doesn't look like a wetland, but it's actually a wonderful, flourishing wetland now that construction has been completed. So after construction, and I will say during construction, Friends of the Sheet's role is to provide construction oversight. So we are going on site pretty much every day that the contractor is working, and even when they're not, especially if we anticipate a heavy rain, to make sure that we are fulfilling the standards of our permit and making sure that we're happy with the quality of the work. But after we complete construction is when we then do our quarterly field and lab monitoring to make sure that we are actually producing the results that we want to see in terms of water quality improvements. So here's some data from that site that I just showed you. So before construction, pH came in around 3.36, and then exit our system about 7.91. And I wanted to point out the dissolved aluminum and total iron levels. So if you remember the slide I showed with the water quality standards, dissolved aluminum for trout is like 0.08. So we are way over that limit before we implemented this project. And then afterward, we did not detect any dissolved aluminum leaving our site. Similarly, iron for trout is 0.5. We still had a little bit of iron leaving our system, but we have seen a decrease in that since it's been a couple of years after construction. But generally, our water quality goals, what we're held to by the conditions of our grant, are reductions of those loads by 80% or greater. So a vast reduction in the pollution loading. So what has that work resulted in? Based on what Friends of the Cheat has accomplished, as well as I would be remiss not to mention the intense efforts from the state and our federal partners, we have seen really the rebirth of the Cheat River. We have built over 20 acid mine drainage systems, so we are completing one right now as we speak. We have a couple more that are in the planning phase that should be completed within the next year. And then we have 2 additional watershed-based plans in motion to start picking up additional sites outside of the watersheds we've been focused in the last 10 years. The Cheat main stem, I'm happy to say, is circumneutral, so we're maintaining pH throughout our watershed in the Cheat basically from Parsons all the way through to its confluence with the Monongahela River. And Muddy Creek, that atrocious photo you saw at the beginning, it is actually meeting water quality standards for pH. There's other issues, namely metals, to be concerned about, but that is in some ways a success. And Muddy Creek, probably for the first time in, several decades, actually had trout in that section. Are they eating much? Probably not, but they were able to persist in Muddy Creek for the first time in several decades because of the work of the DEP to install that watershed scale treatment facility on Muddy Creek. Some other highlights include we did a long-term in-stream study of the headwaters of Muddy Creek and the main stem of Big Sandy Creek and found that both of those sections were meeting water quality standards for pH, aluminum, and iron, and they were previously listed for those impairments. And cumulatively, what that's resulted in that people can see and experience is the return of our acid intolerant species. So we have walleye that have been reestablished in Cheat Lake thanks to the DNR, but they're not staying in Cheat Lake. They're actually running back up the river and using that habitat again, which is really inspiring. And we've also been able to detect hellbender throughout much of the Cheat, not only the main stem, but many of our tributaries in the watershed, who are also pretty sensitive to pH and these metals. Unfortunately, we still have a long way to go. We still have, hundreds of abandoned mineland sites that are in need of reclamation. We also have, in some ways, new threats. So this is a photograph of an incident that happened at that watershed scale treatment facility on Muddy Creek in 2021. While those efforts to treat the most egregious sources of acid mine drainage in Muddy Creek is a noble and challenging cause, it does present new challenges because essentially what we're doing is we're mainlining all of that acid mine drainage to one place, whereas before it was scattered throughout the watershed. So when something goes wrong at that facility, it goes wrong in a big way, and it can cause a lot of problems. So this is where in March of 2021, their lines were clogging faster than they anticipated. Essentially, they were coating with iron really quickly, and they had a failure of one of their pipes. And that failure meant that 8% of the water that should have been going to the treatment facility was not. So it only took 8% of that water to bring Muddy Creek to this state, and pH during this time was back down to 3.5. So that's frightening to think about. That's a real logistical risk. So there are some new challenges that we face in trying to address these issues. And then the other thing that is both, it's a blessing, but it's also something that's been challenging is there's a lot of money coming to the state of West Virginia for abandoned mine lands work. I think in the order of $150 million a year for 15 years. Our state is, trying to figure out how to manage that level of funding with essentially, from my understanding, not really being able to increase their staff, which makes that pretty difficult to manage. So at this time, watershed groups don't have access to that funding. Consultants and the state entities do, but watershed groups do not. So through the work of our acid mine drainage treatment projects and the work of our state and federal partners to improve the Cheat, it's allowed us to think about other forms of restoration that maybe 15 or 20 years ago didn't make sense because we didn't have a lot of species in our river and we didn't have good water quality. And when you think about restoration, that's kind of the basis of where to start. It doesn't make sense to put in a bunch of habitat structures in a river system or a stream system if your pH is so poor you don't have anything to make habitat for. So we're at a stage now where the cheat has improved enough that we're starting to target other projects. The big one is the Albright Dam Removal Project that we've tackled starting in 2020. So other than the dam at Cheat Lake, this is the only barrier on the Cheat River main stem. It's right about halfway between the entire river system itself. So Cheat River is about 78 miles. The dam exists around mile point 30. So this would create a huge level of connectivity in our river system, and it's something we're excited to see. The walleye that I mentioned earlier, they've made it all the way up to this dam, but they're not going any further. Historically, they would have been all the way up into Parsons and probably into some of the tributaries of the Cheat. And we really want to see this removed so that they can do that once again. Some other activities include riparian reforestation, so we're working with private landowners to restore riparian areas on their lands. And we're also tackling smaller aquatic organism passage projects on high-quality trout streams as well. So we're going from the biggest to the smallest when it comes to these aquatic organism passage projects. That's a summary of my presentation, and really thank everyone for letting me be here.